Early in 1942, World War II came directly to Australia when Darwin and other northern cities such as Broome were bombed. The Japanese had plans to capture and occupy Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. It was a strategic plan in order to cut Australia off from their allies, but they were prevented by defeats in two crucial naval battles, the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, both in 1942. Because of these defeats, the Japanese then decided to land on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea and approach Port Moresby overland. They arrived at the coastal town of Gona in 1942, and their intended route to Port Moresby would be the Kokoda track. Because most of Australia's army was serving in the Middle East, Australia did not have many experienced soldiers left to send to ward off the Japanese army. And at the beginning of this campaign, the Australians who were sent to meet the advancing Japanese were mostly conscripts. Many of these guys had been rejected by the army when they volunteered early in the war, and they were known as chocolate soldiers, or chocos, because most people thought that they would melt in the heat of battle. The distance to Port Moresby from Gona was only about 200 kilometres as the crow flies, but the track ran over some of the toughest terrain in the world. It was a narrow, rugged track through dense jungle, swift-flowing rivers and steep mountains. It climbed two mountain ranges, reaching a height of 2,200 metres, and some parts of the track were knee-deep in mud and so steep that if you slipped, it meant death. At the start of the war, the Australians were outnumbered by 10 to 1 and had little equipment. Even their khaki uniforms were the wrong colour for jungle fighting and had to be dyed green. However, the Australians were helped by the local people of Papua, who the Australians called Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. These locals would bring supplies up the track and take wounded men back for medical help. Many Australians owed their lives to these people. And despite all the difficulties, the Australians held the Japanese back and made them fight for every centimetre of jungle. This was critical as they were waiting for the Australian Imperial Force who had been called back from the Middle East to reinforce them. And on the 29th of July, the Australians were forced to retreat from Kokoda and started making their way back towards Port Moresby and fighting what's called a fighting retreat. The Japanese made it 50 kilometres away from Port Moresby before they had to turn back. And they were turned back for a number of reasons. Their supply lines were stretched and the troops were worn out, and the Australians also started pushing them back. The troops were also encouraged by the news of success against the Japanese at a place called Milne Bay, which is on the eastern coast of Papua New Guinea. Japanese troops had landed there on the 25th of August in an attempt to capture a newly built Allied airfield, which they could then use as another base to attack Port Moresby. And after days of bitter fighting in mud and rain, the Australians successfully defended the airfields and forced the Japanese to retreat. This is significant because this is the very first defeat of the Japanese on land in the Pacific, and it destroyed the belief that the Japanese were unbeatable in jungle fighting. And by the end of the Kokoda campaign, the chocolate soldiers, the conscripts, had been joined by the Australian Imperial Force. These troops bolstered the morale and Australian numbers, and the Australian forces drove the Japanese forces back over the track and away from Port Moresby, ultimately keeping Australia safe. And on the 16th of November, Australian and United States troops began attacking Boona and Gona. Gona fell to the Allies on the 1st of December, and a month later, on the 2nd of January, Boona was captured. The Australian victory on the Kokoda Trail was Japan's second defeat on land and marked the start of the Japanese retreat in the Pacific. Remember that Milne Bay was the first defeat, and although the last pockets of resistance were not wiped out until the war ended, the threat of Japanese invasion was over for Australia. In the Kokoda campaign, 625 Australians were killed, over 1,600 wounded. Another 4,000 casualties were due to sickness like dysentery and trench foot. Victory in the Papua campaign ensured Australia's safety and saved Australia from a possible Japanese invasion.